Philip White, Head of Framework Compliance and Operational Risk at UBS. Please give him a hand. Isabel Smith, who leads the GRC program at Johnson & Johnson. Len Sinclair, Group Head of Operational Risk at the Barclays Group. And Sudheesh Babu, who's the General Manager and Global Head of Risk Compliance and Assurance at Wipro Technologies. I'll be more centered. So thank you, everybody, for joining. I'd like to actually just maybe take 30 seconds each to just introduce yourselves and your roles so that the audience can have a good perspective of what you guys do. Go ahead.
Sure. So, Philip White, as Gaurav said, until recently, in fact, the head of framework for compliance and operational risk at UBS, a position I held for 5 years, which I've now relinquished in order to focus on two big programs of work. We've got one very relevant to today, because it is the integration of a good number of our GRC systems across audit, operational risk, business continuity, vendor risk management, IT risk, policy management. Sanjay will remind me, I've probably forgotten a few, but about 10, 12, 15 applications all into the one MetricStream app. And also focusing alongside that how we can restructure our support organization for operational risk framework in a kind of offshore, nearshore environment. So 2 things that are keeping me very busy.
Bel?
Good morning. From Johnson & Johnson, a healthcare company, about 120,000 employees in about 60 countries. So every risk that we've described, I think we have them all. And have been working for the last 5 years to try to bring the process and the technology around the view of all of the risk areas that you described, to try to say how do we bring the connectivity and the interplay between integrating all of those different things. Have been in multiple business areas, so understand each one of those processes from a different point of view in the business. And from doing that, it lets me see where there's so much overlap and ability to streamline things and be able to really look at risk holistically across the company, as opposed to from an individual silo. So the mission kind of I've been on is, again, trying to be the evangelist of going out and bringing different groups together and letting them kind of come to the conclusion of where there's overlaps and synergies between what they're looking at in their risk and compliance areas, and then trying to influence the development of governance around those integrations.
Len, please.
Good morning, everyone. Len Sinclair, Group Head of Operational Risk at Barclays. I've been in that role for the last 3 years. Before that, I was with PwC, where I was a partner in their M&A practice, which had nothing to do with risk, but it was quite interesting. I started life as a bank manager on the high street, moved into risk management, and then moved into transformational consulting, and then decided to go back to my favourite subject, risk. And I've been involved in a MetricStream implementation with Gaurav and the team for the last couple of years.
Thank you, Len. Sudheesh?
Hi, my name is Sudheesh. I manage the governance, risk and compliance practice within Wipro. And this group is primarily focusing on helping customers to roll out various risk management programs, which will include integrated GRC to help customers to elevate the maturity of the risk management through solutions which are in the space of one, transformational in nature, which will include leveraging analytics in a larger way. So we have introduced concepts like risk analytics and intelligence in a big way in managing risk and managing compliance through continuous control monitoring. So we provide consulting to customers. It's an external facing role which I manage, not internal Wipro risk and compliance, and that's about me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudheesh. So one of the things that has come out even in the morning discussions and a lot of our discussions with the customers is how risk is evolving from a post-assurance function to a more performance-driven, or how do you allow companies to make decisions faster, better, whether it's competitive decisions or it is operational decisions. So one of the things I'll want to raise with the panel here is, things seem to be evolving quite fast in terms of the risks that keep you up at night. So just thematically, Phil, I'll go with you first. What are the top risks in the changing environment that you think are keeping people up here?
Yeah, well, I think, to be honest, it's actually the velocity and the change of those risks, whatever they are, that is keeping us awake at night. So, cyber has been mentioned, and clearly cyber is one of the risks that we would have on our top list. But actually, it's not the fact that, can we prevent cyber? At some point, everybody, to an extent or another, is going to get hit by a cyber attack. But for us, the thing is the velocity with which things these days go from a risk to an issue to a crisis. Social media and things are just speeding that process up, no end. And I think for us, it's less about what those key risks are, but are we prepared for them? Can we react to them? Can we react quickly enough to them? So I think more than the actual risks themselves, the theme for us is that velocity and that speed of attack.
Len, any point of view from your side? Given the Barclays, the last few years of journey.
It's quite interesting, picking up what Phil said. I think resilience is probably one of the most consistent themes that I hear when I talk to the board about risk. They're very interested in how well we're controlling the kind of day-to-day stuff. But in truth, I think, as the keynote speech said this morning, the principal issue that people are really worried about is tail risk and stuff coming off left field. And resilience is a good example where, for an organisation of our size, we've got deep pockets. We can afford to spend money to fix stuff, and we can afford to spend money.
Len, I'm going to pause you. Your mic is, I think, not on fully. Can you guys hear at the back?
I don't think anyone will notice.
Okay. Sorry about that.
I'll shout loudly. My team used to run.
Sorry.
Thank you. So resilience and tail risk is probably the area where we're spending most of our time, and it's getting most of our attention.
And Bill, what do you see in that?
I think, building off of both of these, I think the real interest is you need to have a group of people who understand where each other stands on a particular issue. So you take cybersecurity. You can't just have it be your IT group doing cybersecurity. You have to have run scenarios, war games, where what if this happens? Because if you're waiting for the what if to occur and to have those conversations at the point of time it occurs, you just can't react quickly enough. And in order to be able to have that reaction, you have to have all the players know who their peers are for that group, and to understand that I may see the front of the elephant and you may see the back of the elephant, but unless we're figuring out how to stop that elephant charge, we're not going to be able to, hit that risk. And I think that's probably the biggest thing is that ability, in order to react to the velocity with that kind of resiliency, you have to have people who understand risk holistically, and you can pick out the big items from the little items, because there's a lot of risks that are out there that are risks, but in comparison to what may bring your business down, it's some of those big ones that you have to be ready for.
And just building on that slightly, we spend an awful lot of our time now doing scenario analysis, a lot more than we ever did in the past, and we're certainly finding that more and more senior players want to take part in those scenarios, in order to figure out exactly what it is that we need to do and get prepared for it.
And Sudheesh, you have a perspective, obviously, of serving, many companies. What do you see are the biggest themes right now in terms of risk?
Yeah. So one change we have seen in the last 5 years, if you look at the top 10 risk, maybe 5 years back, the cyber risk was appearing close to 10, maybe 7 or 8. Now, if you look at the top 3 risks today, almost everybody is saying that that's one of their top 3 risks. Why this change happened is primarily because the adoption of technologies to transform the way we do business. And again, there are many unknowns, right? We are talking about cloud, we are talking about mobile, we are talking about the way we do business, it's changed. with the adoption of technology or better adoption of technology. So with those adoption, again, the cyber risk has gone up, and there are many unknowns even today in terms of protecting ourselves from various attacks, from incidents. And as Phil rightly mentioned, earlier people were more, doing a lot of investments to prevent attacks or threats. Now we are talking about detection and response. Once an incident happens, how do we quickly respond to those incidents and recover from those events and failures? So again, cyber risk has gone up in the top 3 list now, and again, we continue to see lot more challenges in this space in terms of, kind of moving to from preventive to detective and response to improving the way we can actually prevent through analytics and predictive models.
Thanks, Sudheesh. And Phil, one of the points you earlier raised, and I just want to kind of play that out with the panel. We've talked about, again, risk and opportunity being 2 sides of the same coin, and increasingly seeing companies that are not just responding to risk to prevent them, but also seeing how they can gain competitive advantage. If you see what's happening in the market, all the auto companies within the span of 3 years, literally 3 years, have had to deal with a dramatically changing landscape, like with Uber and Tesla coming into the picture. You look at pharma companies, they consider Google as one of the primary competitors now, which wasn't the case even 5 years ago. You look at outsourcing companies that have managed years of call center, for example, the bot-based management of calls is disrupting that industry. It's happening very fast here. So I'm going to go to you, Bell, first, that how do you, as a company or as an industry, deal with the thinking around risk and opportunity as 2 sides of the same coin? Yeah?
I think basically going at it and saying for the risk, each one of those big risks, like the technology being healthcare, is you have to look at it as an opportunity for innovation. And so if there's a defensive part of it, but the other piece is how do you take the talent in your organization and have it as a goal to say, let's go out and take that risk and see if we can turn it on its head and turn it into an opportunity. So, for instance, Johnson & Johnson's one of the things they did is they, partnership with some of the technology companies to see, what you can do. Other things like 3D printing, which may, take things and medical device and it's something that didn't exist before and make it custom made. You have to be able to have at least a portion of your organization that it's ready to pick up and work with those opportunities. At the same time, it's the scenarios in another form. Instead of looking at them defensively, you're looking at them offensively.
And Len and Phil, any of you, you're seeing a lot of such changes in banking as well. Whether you look at payments, you look at how wealth management is being managed, etc. How, as a framework, how do you internally kind of think about this? Yeah?
I think one of the interesting perspectives that we bring as risk people is around making or helping the business understand what implicit assumptions they're making. It's interesting how business management see the upside and see the opportunity, and when risks come along, the temptation to say risk are trying to stop the business from doing stuff. My view is that I don't want to stop anyone from doing anything. I want them to stop making silly mistakes or to take steps to avoid making mistakes which might come and bite us later. And I think the way we do that is to test people's assumptions, because people are very good at logging some of the obvious assumptions. I find quite often they're not very good at logging some of the implicit assumptions that underpin what they're doing. And by asking questions around innovation, what does that really mean and what are you really accepting? What we find is we have a much richer debate than we would have had, and we're seen as supporting rather than acting as someone who's saying no.
Yeah, I think from our perspective as well, it's all 3 lines of defense getting together to actually not just look at risk in isolation, but look at risk within a context, and that context quite often and then increasingly being the context of process. So, where we have a control failure, not looking at how can we make that control better, but why do we have that control in the first place? What's its point? And so much of our driver now is looking at process front to back. Why do we have the controls that we have? What's their purpose? And I think with risk, that kind of drives you to a position where you look at those processes. First of all, we may be looking at it as where we can reduce risk. But I think what you tend to find is you can just pivot that lens and you can say, now I can see that end-to-end process and I can see what my risks are, but actually, how can I improve the customer experience? Okay, so if I got controls in my process, the more controls I've got probably at some point interferes with the customer experience. So how can I improve my customer experience on the back of that? It probably also drives cost. The more controls I've got, there is probably more cost in the organisation. So if I look at that holistically, I can make sure I'm getting that right balance between risk, customer experience and cost. And I think once you start to do that, the business themselves actually see that there is massive benefit to them. To Len's point, they see all the positive opportunities. Well, actually, you're enhancing those positive opportunities at the same time as controlling that risk.
So taking, a different kind of slant to this, you can put the right structure in place, the right taxonomies in place, the right systems in place. But one of the things that we keep hearing about is culture. How do you set the right culture to make governance better? One of the recent articles that was published by the Telegraph, through research reports was that, if you look at bad behavior, they analyzed bad behavior in the organizations, and they said that 3 of the biggest reasons are corporate stress that forces people to take shortcuts. Second was just short-term behavior, short-term goals, quarterly goals, etc. And the third was just, allowing small breaches to happen that it becomes tolerable. These are the 3 biggest reasons here. These things aren't going away. Short-term targets, quarterly, targets are still going to remain. So, Len, I know over the last 2-3 years, you've adopted a whole series of changes on or thinking on culture at Barclays. How do you kind of balance this, the short-term targets versus driving a culture of governance?
Answers on a postcard. The problem with culture is it's easy to describe, it's hard to measure, and it's really hard to enforce. And we've spent the last 18 months wrestling with risk culture in all sorts of dimensions. One of our previous chief executives, who doesn't get a lot of credit, but actually one of his more profound sayings was, culture is what you do when no one's looking. And I always found that quite an insightful way of thinking about it. We are looking at risk culture in terms of a number of dimensions. Management and governance, what structures do we put around what people do? Motivation and incentives. Incentives account for quite a big chunk of many of the conduct issues we've had over the last 5 to 10 years in the industry. And therefore, managing those incentive programs and linking them better to the return to the customer, to the return to shareholder and the organization is one step. One of the words which gets used a lot, which when I started in banking 30 odd years ago was known but never used, was integrity. And to say that bankers had to act with integrity would have been such an obvious statement of fact when I joined the bank that no one ever thought to mention it because it was such a fundamental part. I hear the integrity word being mentioned all the time, and the point you make about reinforcing behaviour is absolutely fundamental. Identifying bad behaviour, dealing with it, and dealing with consequences. And that C word, the consequence word, is probably the one area that we're focusing more on, not in terms of just recognising bad behaviour and calling it out, but also recognising good behaviour and forcing people to confront some of the decisions that they make. So I don't think we have an answer. I think we've got a huge amount of work in progress, and we're trying to change some of the organisational culture around how and what we do, but the fundamental is consequence.
Bill, any comment?
Yeah, we're very lucky from Johnson & Johnson perspective. Johnson & Johnson has what they've called the credo, which is essentially on integrity, ethics, and really where the customer is in the focus of the business. And at the top of it is the customer focus, the doctors, the nurses, the employees, and then ultimately the stockholders or stakeholders. And for us, you can have all those words, and that's the talk. But the real piece that has tied J&J, and as a long-term employee because of it, together is the fact that they walk the talk. And you can kill culture very, very quickly. You can say all the nice phrases you want, but if people aren't actually doing what the words are acting that way. And so around the world in so many different ways, it is something that is a consistent message everywhere. And that really, from the risk and governance and compliance culture, is really the foundation. and it's there, and it makes doing the other things a little bit easier because that is consistent around the world, and it is something that is, they actually measure it. It's difficult to do, but they actually do surveys of all the employees to measure how well they're doing against that and act upon it. So it really is the basis for going forward on the risk culture.
So obviously, like Len pointed out, it's not necessarily measurable, culture, but a lot of the companies, as we talked in the morning as well, are on the path to seeing how the whole concept of GRC can be more measurable, simplified. So Phil, I'm going to ask you the question that I know that you already mentioned that UBS has been thinking about for the last couple of years on how to simplify the first, second, third line of defense collaboration. Any thoughts on what are the key things that challenges and opportunities that come with that and how companies should tackle that?
Yeah, well, I think it's it's not just about the system, clearly. What we have a tendency to do, and when I say we, I don't mean UBS specifically, but what we tend to do in risk is we overcomplicate everything. And I don't think we make it that easy for the first line of defense to do all of the right things that they're supposed to do. And I think we have a great tendency to try and drive some of the wrong behaviors with what we're doing as a consequence. So I think putting our new system, one of the drivers for that absolutely is to make things simple, to give our people the right data and the right ability to make the decisions that they need to make. But we're also investing quite heavily in a program to simplify our processes. Because, I mean, if you're confronted, you're in the first line of defense, you're trying to make money for the organization, that is your primary objective. And then if everything we do in order to try and manage the risk around that makes that activity more complicated, it really doesn't help. So simplification, not just in systems, but in processes, frameworks, and everything that we do is really our key mantra at the moment.
And Sudheesh, you're obviously in the middle of a lot of these discussions with your clients as well. So what's the top 2-3 challenges, not just like Phil pointed out from a system or a technology perspective, but what are you seeing in companies?
Yeah, and again, the biggest challenge we have seen is people working in silos, and that's true for many organizations, right? Especially global organizations, business units working in silos, regional groups working in silos. As again, Phil mentioned, the integrated reporting and enabling the business to take decisions by providing them the right information about the risk. That's one of the challenges we have seen. So integrated GRC or integrated risk management framework and rolling out a common measurement criteria across the organization is again a bigger challenge we have seen with all the cultural differences to the people working in silos because of regional differences to business unit differences to a whole lot of things. So putting everybody together, having effective communication is more important. Participation of everybody in the organization in risk decision making and the support from the top management. Again, we talked about ethics and integrity. If you have the commitment from the management on ethics and integrity, certainly aspects of reporting will improve a lot because many a times people are suppressed to report certain issues or problems. So the cultural change has to be there and then enabled through an integrated model with the participation of the business is what we've seen as a success model we have seen in the past.
Thanks, thanks, Sudheesh. So one of the thematic things again from here, there's a dichotomy in the belief that investments in the world of risk compliance governance, is it going up or down? Okay, so on one side, and many of the companies are right here, they're trying to simplify, rationalize, how much of governance do you do? How much of testing do you do? There are thousands of people in some of these organizations doing that. And on the flip side, we also hear companies commit a lot more to investments in the world of GRC. So Len, I'll start with you here. What is your thinking around, are the investments going up? Are they going down? Are they stabilizing?
I think they're going up. I think it reflects the nature of the business and the digitization of the business and the need for information. And I think it reinforces one of the other points I think Phil made in his opening comments introducing himself. The idea that you can spend months and years polishing frameworks and policies is interesting, but actually it's the outcome that matters, and it's certainly the outcome that matters to the business. As a consequence, what they want is information to be able to take decisions. And I think that's where we can help and move people away from thinking about process, which has to happen, but frankly, it's a hygiene factor, and moving much more into analytics and data.
Bill?
I definitely think the spend is going up. I think the difficulty is making it valuable spend. For all of these things, it's all about the people side of it. No matter what you do, you can make as many mandates or whatever you want. If you don't have people understanding how they affect each other, you really don't get good results. If you can get enough understanding between groups of why it's important, then you get a different outcome. And so that's one of the things is, as we're investing the money, you need to do it in the process area, but also when you're working on the processes is making sure that the people know why they're working and why do they care. Because if you're just doing it because, that's the job I have to do for the day, you're not going to get to the place that you need to get to. So it's really, the why in it that you have to do. And if you don't bring the people part into it, you can have all the process workshops you want, it won't happen. And then you can use the technology spend to make it valuable. And that's really hard right now, is because the gut reaction is I want to spend the money because I want to do this right now, but you haven't taken the time to make sure the people that are going to be using it are aligned, and that's a killer.
And Phil, I know you guys have been on a path, thinking through this quite a bit. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back again to the fact that you've got to make whatever you do valuable to the business, and they've got to get something out of it. And Len's absolutely right. I mean, even by bringing all of these systems together, essentially all we're doing is taking care of those hygiene factors. So we can see all of our controls, first, second, third line, and then we can identify the duplication and take all of those things out. We can reduce the amount of testing that everybody needs to do because we're all testing the same things. We can get a consistency in that across all three lines of defence, so that we know we're all testing the same things to the same quality standards, etc. But I think but that's taking care of the hygiene, as Len says. Where I think we're going to be going with this is people want to know, to coin that phrase, the unknown unknowns. We're in a position where we've got lots and lots and lots of data, and there's a great risk that we get confused by that data. We've got data, pointing in all different directions. We have regulations coming at us left, right, and centre from around the world, if you're in a global organisation. And they sometimes are, again, pulling us in different directions. So people need to understand what that big data is telling them. What are those unknown unknowns? What are the things that are coming along next? That has risks in itself. Lots of false positives can come out of this. We all know the risks of correlations. But I think that's where we're going to go on one side. But then I think that there's going to be a move more to the kind of, I guess, personalization agenda, with us using a lot more smaller boutique organizations to target specific things, specific risks that we've got, or questions and challenges. So I can see us using a lot of those smaller boutique companies in order to get into niche areas of our business.
Thanks, Phil. So you talked about big data a little bit, but and during the course of the day, we've talked about multiple other technologies that are posing as risks to some of the organizations, whether it's cloud or social, mobility. We talked about blockchain, et cetera. My question is, what are some of the technologies that you are using to actually power up the risk organization or the compliance organizations? You talked a little bit about big data, okay, but what are the other technologies that you're looking to power up versus being wary of them?
Well, I mean, we're starting to look at. We've got a program in the organisation looking at robotics and how that can not help not just the risk organisation clearly, but the organisation as a whole. And if we get the robotics bit right, then potentially that takes risk out of the organisation. Machine learning and artificial intelligence. I think those things are things they're definitely things we're looking at. I think we look at them rather skeptically at the moment. I think they need to prove themselves quite a bit more. We are, in financial services, a little bit risk averse in that kind of area. So I think that's where we're looking to for the future, but we need to wait and see.
Bell?
Well, there's lots of technologies in a lot of things, but in the industry where the healthcare, if you're using customer-facing technology, obviously the big thing between privacy, security, and all those kind of things is uppermost in mind, and all those regulations from around the world are coming at you in all different directions and trying to be figured out as they're going along. So that's definitely a huge area of technology in the group. Obviously, with the big data and data lakes and trying to bring your data from the disparate sources together and be able to use that more effectively, I think that's kind of everyone's holy grail. The question is, again, depending on where the power is in an organization, sometimes those things end up with the focus becomes on that project as opposed to on what you're trying to get out of it. And so I think there's that inherent risk of when you're doing something like that the technology itself doesn't take over the benefit that you're trying to get, and constantly saying, why am I doing this? What's it going to get for the customers? Any benefit, or am I doing it because it's the next coolest thing?
Len, any quick thoughts?
I think there's a real danger that risk tried to lead in some of this stuff, and two themes from the keynote speech this morning that resonated with me. One was around the use of third parties and suppliers and the digitization, both of which are transforming my industry in a way that even 5 years ago I think people would have struggled. I think that's going to make a fundamental difference to how we think about risk. And rather than chase a technology solution now, I think there's a lot of thinking that has to be done around what the business model for the industry looks like and business model for the banks, and then how we use that to apply technology to solve some of the risk issues for management, rather than just necessarily barrel on with technology, which may sound like it contradicts my point earlier. It isn't. We still have to put the hygiene stuff in place. We still have to have data and analytics. But I think there's some big strategic stuff that we have to wrestle with first.
Sudheesh, you guys are obviously in the center of some of these discussions. So what's your thinking here?
Yeah, again, the major change we have seen in the recent past is leveraging cognitive computing in risk analytics and intelligence. When we talk about cognitive computing, it can be to analyze various risks, to continuously monitor the controls, which is a bigger challenge for most of the organization. Today, we do control testing on a quarterly basis or periodic basis, but do we have an opportunity to monitor those continuously to find out the abnormal transactions? So we have seen investment going in this space of cognitive computing and leveraging those solutions, artificial intelligence and machine learning in a big way in risk management decision making. So that's one of the major changes we have seen in the recent past. And again, I'm sure with the maturity going up, these solutions and technologies could be better leveraged for effective decision making.
Thanks. So before we open it up for questions, one last, literally 30-second, one phrase, your advice to the business leaders here. We'll start with Phil.
Work together. As an organization, work together. I quite often use the phrase, the enemy is without, not within. So from a GRC perspective, I would say everybody within the organization needs to work together, not against each other.
You stole mine.
Sorry.
I'll add on top of that, you definitely need to understand how each one is in the organization. And the other piece is very clearly having a view of what are the integrated, if you figure out where the integration sections are that you really need to leverage and help with each other. I think, again, that understanding and getting that fast cycle time is so key.
Rebalance risk and control, more risk, a bit less thinking about control, and focus on what's in front, not what's behind.
And again, I will rather go with everybody's things on collaboration and transparency as themes we should adopt. Collaboration is of course required, and transparency in terms of risk reporting. Again, it's very important to have effective communication across the business and functions. So those are the two themes I would rather go with from a suggestion perspective.
Thanks. Sorry, I missed one question here. We'll start with Bell. Who's going to win the election tomorrow? No, I'm sorry. No. So any questions from the audience? We have time for probably 3 or 4, and you can direct it directly to one of the panel members or the panel. None? I think people are still shy.
If anyone has a question, just raise your hand and we have a mic for you.
Any coffee?
Yes. This mic. Here. Yeah, they're shy.
So my question is, how do you guys see the cloud, and does it, how is the organizations adopting cloud in your respective organizations, and what are the pros and cons that goes into your thinking as you look at the cloud today versus maybe 2 years back? Has something materially changed there?
So, does any of you want to volunteer? Bell, I know you guys are thinking, but I'll have.
Feel
Go ahead,
free.
Bell.
So Johnson & Johnson is using the cloud J&J is very conservative, so very conservatively, obviously. And it's really around making sure that there's the appropriate security. It's really the data and where the data is and making sure that it's protected. So it's using it with making sure the appropriate controls and the risks, are looked at very carefully. The other piece is, again, making sure that there's a consistent framework for how you go after the cloud. And again, because it's very simple, any vendor is out there trying to sell, hey, you can, be in the cloud in 2 seconds, but trying to have something consistent so that you always know where your data is and making sure that the security is there around it.
I agree, and I think one of the biggest issues for banking is data security in the cloud, and particularly customer data. It's fundamental, and whilst it may not lead to a lot of financial loss, the reputational damage is absolutely critical. And given the reputation of banking hasn't been at its best for the last 10 years, I'm not sure we could have any undue risk in terms of using the cloud. I think from an operating model point of view, the cloud's fundamental. You talk about disruptive technology, and the cloud clearly is one of the most disruptive technologies for stable industries like financial services. We're reacting, and as you might imagine, we have extensive programs looking at the use of cloud technologies. For us, it's an issue of scale, it's reach, but fundamentally security.
French, you had a question?
Sure. Now, we've heard a lot about sort of new fintech, models and so on that are affecting the financial services industry. So, I'd kind of like our UBS and Barclays guys, are there risks that are coming from fintech, as far as you're concerned, or are these opportunities that you're dealing with?
I think for the most part, they're opportunities in as much as a lot of clients that we would deal with are interested in what those new technologies are bringing, but not necessarily willing to put their money and their investments and things with some of those boutique operations. So I think we kind of get the benefit, I guess, to a certain extent of we can be second movers, but with a big client base behind us. So, the new fintech companies coming along get the opportunity to try it out. Some of our clients clearly will be interested in that, but and move into them and being first base movers themselves. But for the most part, it gives us a great opportunity to learn from those things and come up with our own innovative products and opportunities of our own. I don't think we see it as a huge risk, but definitely as an opportunity to move into new investments, new ways of delivering our products to our client base.
So bankers in London don't see fintech the same way that taxi drivers in Paris see Uber. Is that right?
Well, I was going to say that one of the problems with that kind of disruptive technology is that you can't control it. And we invest a lot in fintech accelerator programs and looking to identify opportunities, which is fantastic, and clearly we have a huge commercial and social benefit from that. I think the danger is for a large-scale volume business, as we are across 70-odd countries, having small financial technology companies disintermediating parts of our business is clearly a threat as well. And how we respond to that is a big challenge. I think the other thing is, again, perhaps show my age, one of the interesting things of having spent 20-odd years managing change is that robustness of some of the technologies is really important, particularly when you're trying to run things at scale. The danger is trying to translate small fintech into large volume players, and some have done it successfully, and some bring a different set of risks, particularly continuity of the developer and continuity of the business. And that has a big impact for us in terms of the long-term health of our business. So that there's pluses and minuses we have to think about.
Thank you. Any last questions? We have a couple of minutes. If you could also introduce yourself, that'll be great.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Bart van Eyck. I work for Polkat, a technology company. I just wonder, there's a lot of talk about disruptive technology and big data. Do you, well, any of the panel members here, do you use or apply logic to unstructured data? So do you take into your GRC kind of models, account, social media or other unstructured data means to dissect whether there is risks in your organization or potential risks that are going to hit you? Thank you.
So I think, Phil, you I think had raised one of the points earlier. So
yeah, I mean, we do, but I think we should do an awful lot more of it. And I guess I would maybe describe what we do at the moment as kind of semi-structured. So we've kind of got an idea of where we're going and what we're trying to get out of it, rather than necessarily just throwing questions at a set of data, which I think we'd like to get at more. We certainly do things on, picking up on social media and where that's taken us, and that raising a few flags and things for us. But I guess my nervousness on a lot of that is how many false positives are we going to get out of this? How many rabbit holes are we going to end up going down, and focusing valuable resources on which actually don't tell us anything. So I think it's somewhere we want to go, but I think at the moment, again, it needs to prove itself a little bit more, and we need to make sure that we're following the right path and the right information.
Okay. Any other questions here? Yeah, now we're opening up. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, my name is Fabian from Deutsche Bank, and I had a question for you with regards to, we mentioned a few times enabling the first line making decisions with GRC. And I was wondering if you had spent some time in the last, 3 or 4 or 5 years after the crisis, that you have looked at how decisions are made, how to align risk and responsibility and accountability. Have you made any changes with regards to that are more significant than in the years before that?
Yeah, I guess these are more aligned with the business planning process now than they probably were before. And I think, if you go back 5, 6 years, risk would be presented, certainly operational risk in any case, would be presented with the signed off business plan, and this is what we're going to do. We're very much, fore and centre with that now. So far more collaboration again between us and the first line, far more questions of us from the first line in terms of their business planning and their operations more generally, with things like the process activities that are going on. It's everybody engaged. It's not individual pockets, and then we kind of put it all together at the end. There's a lot of linkage now between reward and risk. So again, before bonuses and things can get settled, we're engaged in that process, so that we're giving our view of how the bank and those individual first line areas are running their businesses. So we're very much more engaged in the process, and to the extent the first line will ever make us willingly engaged, we are so. They certainly come to us, and that's a part of our measure of success. They come to us with great regularity rather than us always having to come to them.
I think one of the interesting things in banking has been the impact of the financial crisis on capital, and capital as a constraint. So people have to be more thoughtful about how they apply the capital, and therefore they have to plan better. And part of that is about understanding risk appetite and risk capacity and planning. And I think that's where we've managed to get a bigger role. And I think as a consequence, management are more aware. And I mentioned at the outset around assumptions. Again, challenging people's underlying assumptions is really important, because when people see opportunity, they sometimes find it convenient not to think about some of the consequences of those opportunities. And balancing capital, appetite, and business plan, I think, is a really important role for us, and we've done a lot more of that in the last 3 or 4 years.
Sorry. Any last question before we break?
So Mark Ferrer from Swiss Re. You've all talked about how collaboration is very important and everyone works together, but I'm interested in who is that working together. So do you mean, for example, that every single member of your organisation should understand the risks and controls that are applicable to them? So even the real frontline workers?
Yeah, so I mean, just as an example, when we do our version of an RCSA, for example, that will be done mainly by workshops where we've got COOs in the room. We've potentially in some areas got things like desk heads or client advisors will be engaged in that to an extent as well. We'll have the support functions involved in there, so IT and operations in those rooms, and audit come along to those as well. And it's definitely not just the business risk managers from those areas. We engage real people who are sitting there actually doing their job. So when we do our RCSAs, when we do our scenario analysis for capital, CCAR and all of those other things, we've got real people from real parts of the business who are in those workshops talking to us about what it's really like at the coalface. So those things go into our risk control self-assessments, for example. So there's one example of how we're doing that, bringing everybody together.
Bill, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the very first things is, we started out several years ago as for an awareness piece, is not everybody knew who else was working in risk, because we were very, working in a lot of silos. There were a lot of different specific risks, like, insurance risk versus product risk versus R&D risk type situation, where everyone didn't realize that, everyone who was working there. So a lot of it in the beginning was just having sessions where people could get together and present what they were doing with risks. And you had a lot of these aha moments of like, oh, I didn't know you were doing that and doing that. And once you started to get that together and people started to realize who each other were, then you can get to that next stage, which is really what you want to get to, where you are in the maturity curve of having those cross-functional people want to come to meetings to discuss either something, a new opportunity or something that's occurred, that they want to analyze. But people have to want to do that, because otherwise everybody shows up to the meeting defensive, and that doesn't get you anywhere. So it's really that you first got to have people know each other before they can, come together and really collaborate.
Just one final point on that from me. Every time someone drives a car, they do a risk assessment, and therefore you expect every driver to be risk aware. I think it's the same with our organisations. We take risk everywhere. I remember my first job in the bank, when I was a 21-year-old graduate, was filing statements and sending them out to clients. And week one, I sent the wrong statement to the wrong client. And there was a data breach that caused a fair amount of noise at the time. Irrelevant in the overall scheme of things, but it's quite an important risk lesson about data confidentiality and data protection. And I think unless every member of staff is aware of risk, particularly operational risk, I think there's a danger that the whole risk culture thing becomes an esoteric conversation, whereas you want people to think about risk as they do their job.
So I'm going to take a pause here. One thing I do want to remind, as I mentioned in the morning, there's a very fascinating variety of people in the room, coming from different industries. We've got people from the airline industry sitting right here. We've got, from the nuclear industry, the European Central Bank. So just please, find your way. We'll help you facilitate that. But, hopefully this session was useful, and I thank you very much for all the insights. Very valuable. Thank you.